My son-in-law threw me out of the house on Christmas Eve, but I got my revenge, and my name is Patricia Sullivan, and at 52 years old, I never imagined I'd find myself standing in the freezing December snow with nothing but the clothes on my back and a broken heart. But that's exactly where my son-in-law David left me on Christmas Eve 2024, in front of what used to be my own home in suburban Denver, Colorado. The house where I raised my daughter Emily for 23 years after her father walked out on us when she was just 5. The house where I worked 3 jobs to keep the mortgage current, where I painted every wall myself, where I planted the rose garden that still blooms every spring, the house that somehow became theirs after Emily married David 3 years ago. I can still hear his voice echoing in my mind, cold and calculating as winter itself. Patricia, you're no longer welcome here. Emily agrees. Pack your essentials and leave. Tonight. The man who used to call me Mom Sullivan with that charming smile, the same man I welcomed into our family with open arms, had just delivered the cruelest blow imaginable. And my daughter, my own flesh and blood, stood behind him in silence, her eyes unable to meet mine. How did it come to this? How did the woman who sacrificed everything for her family end up cast out like yesterday's trash on the holiest night of the year? It started slowly, like poison seeping into water. David moved in after their wedding and gradually, subtly, began changing everything. First, it was small suggestions about modernizing the house. Then came the comments about my outdated ways of doing things. The way I loaded the dishwasher was wrong. The way I arranged the living room furniture was inefficient. My cooking wasn't sophisticated enough for their dinner parties. Emily, my sweet Emily, who used to defend me against anyone and everyone, began nodding along with his criticisms. "Mom, maybe David has a point," she'd say softly, avoiding my eyes. "Maybe it's time to update some things around here." But the house wasn't really the issue. The house was just the beginning. David had been systematically undermining my relationship with my daughter, poisoning her against me with carefully planted seeds of doubt. He convinced her that I was controlling, that I couldn't let go, that I was somehow holding back their marriage by living in their space, their space. When did my home become their space? When did the mortgage I still helped pay become their responsibility alone? When did the daughter I raised with my own 2 hands become someone who could look at me with such cold indifference? Standing there in the snow, watching my breath create small clouds in the frigid air, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I'd ever made. Every double shift I worked while Emily slept peacefully in her bed. Every birthday party I threw on a shoestring budget. Every school play I attended, cheering louder than any other parent in the auditorium. Every sleepless night I spent worrying about her future, planning and saving and dreaming of the day she'd have everything I never did. This was my reward. This was what unconditional love had earned me. The neighborhood was twinkling with Christmas lights, and through the windows of my former home, I could see the warm glow of the tree I'd helped Emily decorate just days before. The same tree where presents with my name on them probably still sat, gifts I'd never received, from a daughter who'd apparently decided I no longer deserved her love. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my sister Janet in Phoenix. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow, safe travels." She was expecting me for Christmas dinner, but how could I explain that I was no longer welcome in my own home? How could I admit that I'd somehow failed so completely as a mother that my own child had chosen her husband over me? The truth was, I'd seen the signs but ignored them. I'd watched David's manipulation tactics, recognized them from my own marriage to Emily's father, but I'd convinced myself that Emily was stronger than I had been, that she'd never let a man control her the way I'd been controlled. I was wrong. Now, standing in the cold with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, because David had systematically isolated me from most of our mutual friends over the past year, I had a choice to make. I could crumble under the weight of this betrayal, or I could find a way to fight back. I pulled out my phone and opened a rideshare app, my fingers trembling not just from the cold, but from the rage that was beginning to build in my chest. As I waited for my ride to the airport, I made myself a promise. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. David thought he'd won, thought he'd successfully removed the obstacle to his complete control over Emily. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated a mother's love and the lengths she'll go to protect her child, even from herself. I was going to Phoenix, but I wouldn't be staying long. I had work to do, plans to make, and a son-in-law to remind that you don't mess with a woman who's already lost everything once and survived. The car pulled up, and as I climbed into the back seat, I caught one last glimpse of my house through the window. "Merry Christmas, David," I whispered into the darkness. "Enjoy it while you can." So, where you're watching from tonight, I hope you'll stick around for this story. Please like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The flight to Phoenix gave me 7 hours to think, and by the time we landed, I had begun to see the bigger picture of David's manipulation. Sitting in that cramped airplane seat, staring out at the dark expanse of America below, I started connecting dots I'd been too trusting to notice before. David had been playing a long game, and I'd been the perfect mark. It began with the finances. 6 months after moving in, David suggested that since he was contributing significantly to the household, maybe the house should be put in both his and Emily's names. For tax purposes, he'd said with that practiced smile, and to protect everyone's investment. I'd hesitated, but Emily had looked at me with such hope, such love for this man she'd married, that I'd agreed. After all, Emily was my only child, and eventually everything I owned would be hers anyway. That was my first mistake. The second came when David convinced Emily that I was too involved in their financial decisions. "Your mother means well," he'd tell her when he thought I couldn't hear. "But we need to establish our independence as a couple." Gradually, I was excluded from conversations about household expenses, maintenance, and long-term planning. The woman who'd managed that property for over 2 decades was suddenly treated like a tenant whose opinions didn't matter. Janet picked me up at Sky Harbor Airport, and the moment I saw her concerned face, I broke down completely. My sister, 5 years younger but infinitely wiser when it came to reading people, had never liked David. She'd warned me from the beginning, but I'd been so happy to see Emily happy that I'd dismissed her concerns as jealousy or overprotectiveness. "I knew this day would come," Janet said as we drove through the desert night toward her home in Scottsdale. "That man has been isolating Emily from you since day one, and you let him because you wanted to keep the peace." She was right, and it hurt to admit it. Over Christmas dinner with Janet's family, I laid out the whole sorry tale. How David had gradually convinced Emily that I was judgmental about their lifestyle choices. How he'd intercepted phone calls and claimed I was busy when Emily tried to include me in their plans. How he'd even gone so far as to suggest that my empty nest syndrome was making me clingy and dependent on Emily in unhealthy ways. The worst part was realizing how many of my own friendships had suffered because of David's influence. When my longtime neighbor Carol had invited me to her book club, David had made comments about middle-aged women with too much time on their hands. When my former colleague Lisa had suggested we start a small business together, David had questioned whether I was really ready for that kind of stress at my age. Every suggestion, every opportunity, every potential source of independence and fulfillment outside of my relationship with Emily had been subtly undermined by a man who recognized that my strength lay in my connections to others. He'd systematically severed those connections, leaving me dependent on Emily for social interaction and emotional support, which made it easier for him to paint me as the problem when I naturally wanted to spend time with my only child. "He's a classic narcissist," Janet's husband, Robert, observed. Robert was a retired psychiatrist, and his analysis was as uncomfortable as it was accurate. He identified you as the primary threat to his control over Emily, so he's been working to eliminate your influence. The Christmas Eve confrontation wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. He needed a dramatic moment to make the separation seem like Emily's choice rather than his manipulation. But there was something else, something that had been nagging at me since that terrible night. David's sudden urgency to get me out of the house, his insistence that it happen immediately on Christmas Eve of all nights. Why the rush? What was he afraid I might discover if I stayed? The answer came to me while I was helping Janet organize her home office the day after Christmas. As we sorted through old tax documents, Janet mentioned that her financial advisor had warned her about a new scam targeting older homeowners, specifically adult children and their spouses, who manipulated parents into transferring property deeds, then took out loans against the property without the original owner's knowledge. My blood ran cold. I immediately called my bank, my credit monitoring service, and my insurance company. What I discovered made me physically sick. David had taken out a second mortgage on my house 3 weeks ago, $50,000 secured against the property that still had my name on the deed alongside Emily's and his. The loan application listed him as the primary contact, and all correspondence had been sent to a P.O. box I'd never heard of. But that wasn't all. He'd also opened 2 credit cards using the house as collateral and had been systematically draining my credit score with late payments and high balances. The man had been stealing from me for months, using my own generosity against me and planning to leave me holding the bag for debts I'd never agreed to take on. Now, I understood the rush to get me out of the house. He needed me gone before the monthly statements arrived, before I could discover what he'd done. And if something went wrong, if the loans couldn't be repaid, he could claim I'd been complicit, or worse, that I'd been the one pressuring them into borrowing against their family home. Emily might not even know what her husband had done, or she might be fully complicit. Either way, my daughter was now married to a criminal, and I was the victim of identity theft and fraud. As I sat in Janet's kitchen, documenting every piece of evidence I'd uncovered, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or family dynamics anymore. This was about justice, about protecting not just myself, but potentially Emily too, if she was as much a victim of David's manipulation as I was. I hired a lawyer that afternoon, a sharp, experienced woman named Margaret Chen, who specialized in elder fraud and family financial abuse. Margaret was younger than Emily, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said after reviewing my documentation, "you have grounds for both criminal and civil action. Your son-in-law has committed multiple felonies, and if your daughter was aware of any of this, she could be considered an accessory." The thought of Emily facing criminal charges made my stomach turn, but Margaret was right. I needed to know the truth. We filed a police report, initiated fraud investigations with the credit agencies, and began the process of freezing all accounts connected to my identity. But I knew David wouldn't go down without a fight, and his next move would probably be to convince Emily that I was the one attacking their family. I needed to be prepared for that. needed to have irrefutable evidence not just of his crimes but of his manipulation tactics. That's when Margaret suggested something that would change everything. "Mrs. Sullivan, have you considered the possibility that you're not his first victim? Men like David don't usually start with financial fraud. They work their way up to it. There might be others, ex-girlfriends, former colleagues, maybe even previous in-laws who could provide testimony about his patterns of behavior." The hunt was about to begin. Finding David's past victims took 3 weeks of careful investigation, and what we uncovered exceeded my worst expectations. Margaret connected me with a private investigator named Tony Martinez, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes and had an uncanny ability to trace digital footprints. David wasn't just a manipulative son-in-law. He was a career con artist with a 15-year history of targeting vulnerable women and their families. His real name wasn't even David Morrison. It was Derek Michaels, and he'd been using variations of that identity across multiple states. Before Emily, there had been Sarah in Portland, whose elderly mother had lost her home to a foreclosure she never saw coming. Before Sarah, there was Jennifer in Austin, whose family business had mysteriously collapsed after Derek gained access to their financial accounts. And before Jennifer, there was Amanda in Chicago, whose father had died suddenly after signing over a power of attorney to Derek during what appeared to be a brief but intense illness. The pattern was always the same: find a woman with family, money, or property, charm his way into the family structure, isolate the primary financial decision maker, and then extract as much value as possible before disappearing. The only reason he hadn't disappeared from Emily's life yet was that I'd been living in the house, making it impossible for him to complete his usual exit strategy. That's why Christmas Eve had been so important to his timeline. He needed me gone so he could finish bleeding the property dry and then vanish, leaving Emily holding the debt and wondering what had happened to her perfect husband. But Derek had made a crucial mistake this time. He'd fallen in love with the lifestyle my house provided, the respectability, the community standing, the perfect cover of a devoted husband and son-in-law. Instead of his usual hit-and-run approach, he'd gotten comfortable, greedy. He'd started to believe his own performance. That overconfidence would be his downfall. Tony's investigation revealed that Derek was currently juggling multiple financial schemes beyond the mortgage fraud. He'd convinced Emily to co-sign for a business loan to start a consulting company that existed only on paper. He'd taken out life insurance policies on both Emily and me, with himself as the primary beneficiary. Most disturbing of all, he'd been researching my medical history and had recently purchased several untraceable substances online that could cause heart problems in older adults. The man wasn't just stealing from me. He was potentially planning to kill me. That revelation changed everything. This was no longer about getting my house back or even protecting my relationship with Emily. This was about saving our lives. Margaret immediately contacted the FBI, and within 48 hours, Derek Morrison Michaels was under federal surveillance. But we couldn't simply have him arrested. Not yet. We needed to catch him in the act of committing new crimes, and we needed Emily's cooperation to build an airtight case. The challenge was reaching Emily without alerting Derek. According to our phone records analysis, Derek had been monitoring and controlling most of Emily's communications for months. Her social media activity had dropped to almost nothing. Her longtime friendships had been systematically ended through manufactured conflicts, and even her work relationships had been strained by Derek's interference. My daughter had become a prisoner in her own life, and she probably didn't even realize it. Tony suggested we use Emily's one remaining weakness, that Derek hadn't been able to control: her concern for animals. Emily had always been passionate about animal rescue, and Derek hadn't been able to eliminate that interest without raising too many red flags about his controlling behavior. We created a careful plan. I would accidentally encounter Emily at the animal shelter, where she volunteered every Saturday morning, one of the few activities Derek still allowed her, probably because it made him look compassionate by association. Saturday morning, February 14th, I walked into the Denver animal shelter with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I hadn't seen Emily since Christmas Eve, and I wasn't sure what kind of reception I'd receive. Derek had probably spent the last 2 months poisoning her mind against me even further. Emily was in the kitten room, bottle feeding a litter of abandoned babies. She looked thinner than I remembered, more tired, and there was something fragile about her that hadn't been there before. When she saw me, her face went through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, guilt, and something that might have been relief. "Mom," she whispered, looking around nervously as if Derek might materialize from behind the cat carriers. "Hello, sweetheart," I said as gently as I could. "I've missed you." What happened next broke my heart. Emily began to cry, not the angry tears of a daughter who felt betrayed by her mother, but the desperate tears of a woman who'd been drowning and had just seen a lifeline. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry about Christmas Eve. I wanted to call you, but David said you needed space to think about your behavior, and that pushing you would just make things worse. He said you were angry with me, that you blamed me for taking his side." Of course he had. Even Derek's explanations for my absence had been designed to increase Emily's sense of isolation and guilt. I held my daughter while she cried, and slowly, carefully, I began to tell her what I'd discovered. Not everything, not yet. I started with the financial irregularities, the second mortgage, the credit cards. I watched her face change as the truth sank in, watched her begin to question everything she thought she knew about her husband. "But that's impossible," she kept saying. "David handles all our finances because I'm terrible with money. He's been protecting me from the stress of dealing with all that complicated stuff." "Emily," I said gently, "when was the last time you saw a bank statement? When was the last time you looked at your credit report? When was the last time you made a financial decision without asking David's permission first?" The look on her face told me she was starting to understand. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end of our conversation, Emily had agreed to help us gather evidence against Derek. She would pretend that nothing had changed while secretly documenting his activities and providing us with access to information only she could obtain legally. It was dangerous. If Derek suspected she was working against him, there was no telling what he might do. But Emily was stronger than I'd given her credit for, and she was motivated by a powerful realization. She'd been living with a stranger who'd been planning to destroy both of us. "Mom," she said as we prepared to leave the shelter separately, "there's something else. David's been giving me pills. Says they're vitamins, but they make me feel foggy and tired all the time. I stopped taking them this week because I wanted to think clearly, and I've been feeling so much better. Do you think—" I thought Derek had been drugging my daughter to keep her compliant, but I couldn't say that out loud. "Not yet. Why don't you save a few of those pills?" I suggested. "We can have them tested by a laboratory, just to make sure they're what David says they are." Emily nodded, and I could see the determination building in her eyes. My little girl was coming back to me, and together we were going to take down the man who'd almost destroyed us both. Derek's 15-year winning streak was about to come to an end. Over the next 6 weeks, Emily proved to be a better investigator than I'd ever imagined possible. Years of living under Derek's control had taught her to be observant, to notice details, to read the subtle signs of when someone was lying. She'd developed these skills to survive her marriage, and now she was using them to dismantle it. The pills Derek had been giving her tested positive for a combination of mild sedatives and mood suppressants. Nothing that would kill her, but enough to keep her docile and compliant. The prescription bottles they came from belonged to elderly patients of a clinic where Derek had briefly worked as a patient advocate 2 years earlier. More theft, more fraud, more evidence of a man who saw other people as resources to be exploited. But Emily's most valuable contribution was access to Derek's home office, a room I'd rarely been allowed to enter during my time in the house. Working with FBI guidance, she installed tiny cameras and audio recording devices during Derek's weekly poker nights with his buddies from work. What we captured exceeded everyone's expectations. Derek wasn't just running one con. He was operating an entire network of scams from my dining room table. Thursday nights, when Emily thought he was playing poker, he was actually meeting with 2 other con artists to coordinate their activities across the Denver metropolitan area. They called themselves the Family Men because they specialized in targeting family assets through romantic relationships. Each of them had a primary target. Derek's was our family. But they also worked together on larger schemes involving real estate fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. They kept detailed files on dozens of potential victims, including psychological profiles, financial assessments, and what they called exploitation timelines. The recording of their February 28th meeting was particularly damning. Derek spent 20 minutes bragging about how easily he'd manipulated Emily and me, describing in clinical detail how he'd isolated me from my support network and drugged Emily into compliance. The old lady actually signed the deed transfer without even reading it, he laughed. And the daughter is so whipped she'd probably help me bury the body if I asked her to. These family types are so desperate to keep everyone happy. They'll sacrifice themselves before they'll make waves. His associates were impressed by his progress but concerned about the timeline. Apparently, Derek had promised them he'd be ready to liquidate and relocate by the end of March. He was behind schedule and they were pressuring him to finish the job and move on to fresh territory. That's when Derek mentioned his insurance policies and his backup plan for dealing with me permanently. If the old bitch comes back and starts causing problems, she might just have an accident, he said casually. Heart attack, slip and fall, maybe a car accident. Widow ladies in their 50s are unfortunately prone to these things, especially when they're under stress about losing their homes. I listened to that recording in Margaret's office with Emily beside me, both of us holding hands and fighting back tears. My daughter had been married to a man who was planning to murder me, and she'd been so thoroughly manipulated that she would have unknowingly helped him do it. The FBI was ready to move, but Margaret suggested we wait for one more piece of evidence. Derek, in the act of attempting to access the larger pool of money he'd been working toward. According to the recordings, Derek believed I had a substantial retirement account and life insurance policy that Emily would inherit when I died. He'd been planning to convince Emily to make him the beneficiary of those assets, then eliminate me and disappear with the money. There was just one problem with his plan. Those accounts didn't exist, at least not in the amounts he believed. Derek had been working from outdated information, probably gathered during his initial research into our family. I'd lost most of my retirement savings during my divorce from Emily's father, and what little I'd managed to rebuild was tied up in annuities that couldn't be accessed without my direct involvement. But Derek didn't know that, and his ignorance gave us the perfect opportunity to trap him. Working with the FBI, we created a fake financial portfolio that made it appear I had nearly $300,000 in easily accessible accounts. We leaked this information to Derek, through carefully planted documents that Emily accidentally left where he would find them. Then we waited for him to take the bait. He bit faster than we'd expected. Within a week of discovering the fake portfolio, Derek began pressuring Emily to discuss my estate planning. He expressed concern that I might be getting older and possibly developing memory problems, suggesting that Emily should consider taking power of attorney over my affairs to protect me from making poor financial decisions. Emily played her part perfectly, expressing uncertainty about such a big responsibility and suggesting that maybe Derek should be involved in those conversations since he was so good with financial matters. Derek, of course, agreed to help, probably already calculating how quickly he could drain those accounts once he had legal access to them. The trap was set for March 15th, a meeting at Margaret's office where Derek thought he'd be helping Emily establish legal control over my finances. Instead, he'd be walking into a room full of FBI agents with enough evidence to put him away for the rest of his life. But first, we had one more score to settle. On March 10th, exactly 3 months after Derek threw me out of my house on Christmas Eve, Emily and I executed the final phase of our plan. While Derek was at one of his poker nights, Emily packed her essential belongings and moved them to a secure location. Then she changed the locks on the house. You see, during our investigation, we discovered that the deed transfer Derek had manipulated me into signing was invalid due to the fraudulent circumstances under which it was obtained. Margaret had been working with the courts to restore my full ownership of the property, and as of March 9th, I was once again the sole legal owner of my home. Derek Morrison, the man who'd thrown me out of my own house, was now officially trespassing on my property. When Derek came home that night and found his key didn't work, Emily was waiting for him on the porch with a simple message. "The house belongs to my mother and you're no longer welcome here. Pack your essentials and leave. Tonight." The look on his face when he realized he'd been outmaneuvered was worth every moment of pain he'd put us through. For 15 years, Derek had been the one in control, the one with all the power, the one who decided who stayed and who left. Not anymore. Emily handed him a single suitcase with some clothes and toiletries, then watched as he drove away into the night, probably heading to one of his criminal associates for shelter. He had no idea that federal agents were following his every move, waiting for March 15th to close the net around him permanently. As we stood on the porch of my house, our house, Emily turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I let him turn me against you. I'm sorry I didn't see what he was doing. I'm sorry I didn't protect you." "You were protecting yourself, baby," I told her. "That's what people do when they're being abused. And when you were strong enough, you protected both of us. I'm proud of you." We spent that night talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Emily told me about the subtle ways Derek had controlled her daily life, from monitoring her phone calls to discouraging her friendships to making her feel guilty for wanting to spend time with me. I told her about the loneliness I'd felt as I watched our relationship deteriorate and how I'd blamed myself for not being a good enough mother to keep her love. We both cried and we both laughed, and by morning, we were mother and daughter again. But our work wasn't finished yet. Derek still had 5 days of freedom left, and we intended to make sure he used them exactly the way we wanted him to. Derek spent those 5 days doing exactly what we'd predicted, scrambling to salvage his con while simultaneously planning his escape route. The FBI surveillance teams reported that he'd visited 3 different used car dealers, inquired about quick cash sales of jewelry and electronics, and had heated phone conversations with his criminal associates about cutting their losses and going to ground. But Derek's arrogance was his weakness. Even facing the collapse of his carefully constructed scheme, he couldn't resist the idea of one final score. The fake financial portfolio we dangled in front of him was too tempting to abandon, and his greed overrode his survival instincts. On March 14th, the day before our arranged meeting, Derek made his fatal mistake. He attempted to access my fabricated accounts using forged power of attorney documents. The bank, which had been alerted to the ongoing federal investigation, immediately contacted the FBI when Derek presented documents claiming to represent my financial interests. Within hours, agents had arrested him for identity theft, attempted fraud, and forgery, charges that would keep him locked up while they built their larger case. But I wanted more than Derek's arrest. I wanted him to face the truth about what he'd done, to confront the reality that his victims weren't just numbers in his schemes, but real people whose lives he'd shattered. I wanted him to understand that his 15-year winning streak had ended not because of bad luck or poor planning, but because he'd finally victimized someone who refused to stay down. Margaret arranged for me to attend Derek's arraignment hearing, where he would learn the full scope of the charges against him. Emily chose not to come. She wasn't ready to see the man she'd married reduced to an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, but she supported my decision to be there. The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected, and when they brought Derek in, he looked diminished somehow. Gone was the confident charmer who'd manipulated his way into our family. In his place sat a pale, nervous man whose carefully constructed persona had finally cracked under the weight of his own lies. When Derek's eyes found mine across the courtroom, I saw recognition, confusion, and then pure hatred flash across his face. He'd expected to face anonymous victims and bureaucratic prosecutors, not the woman he'd thrown out into the snow 3 months earlier. The prosecutor, a sharp young man named James Rodriguez, methodically outlined the charges: 15 counts of fraud, 12 counts of identity theft, 8 counts of elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. As the list continued, Derek's face grew paler, and his court-appointed attorney looked increasingly overwhelmed. But the moment I'd been waiting for came when Prosecutor Rodriguez began presenting evidence of Derek's victims across multiple states. One by one, he described the women Derek had targeted, the families he'd destroyed, the elderly parents who'd lost their homes, the widows who'd been left penniless, the children who'd been manipulated into betraying their own mothers and fathers. Derek's method was always the same: identify the family's emotional weak points, exploit existing tensions and insecurities, gradually isolate his primary target from their support systems, then extract maximum financial value before disappearing. He was a psychological predator who fed on love, trust, and the fundamental human desire for family harmony. When the prosecutor finished his presentation, the judge, a stern woman in her 60s who reminded me of my third-grade teacher, looked directly at Derek with unconcealed disgust. "Mr. Michaels, or Morrison, or whatever your real name might be," she said, "in 30 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered such calculated cruelty. You didn't just steal money from your victims, you stole their relationships, their trust, their faith in their own judgment. You turned children against parents and spouses, against each other. You weaponized love itself." Derek's attorney attempted to respond, but the judge held up her hand. "I'm not finished. What makes your crimes particularly heinous is that you targeted the very relationships that should provide comfort and security in times of trouble. You made mothers doubt their own children's love. You made children question their parents' motives. You corrupted the basic human bonds that hold families and communities together." She set Derek's bail at $2 million, an amount his frozen assets and seized accounts couldn't begin to cover, and remanded him to custody pending trial. As the bailiff led Derek away in shackles, he turned to look at me one more time. This time, I met his gaze steadily and let him see something in my eyes that he'd never seen before: victory. After the hearing, Prosecutor Rodriguez introduced me to some of Derek's other victims who'd traveled to Denver for the arraignment. Sarah from Portland, whose mother had died in a nursing home after losing her house to Derek's schemes. Jennifer from Austin, whose family business had employed 12 people before Derek destroyed it. Amanda from Chicago, whose father's accidental death was now being investigated as a possible homicide. We spent the afternoon sharing our stories, and I was struck by how similar our experiences had been. Derek had used the same playbook on all of us: identify the family's financial assets, map the emotional relationships, find the person with the most influence over those assets, then systematically destroy their credibility while positioning himself as the reasonable, helpful alternative. But we'd all survived. More than that, we'd found our strength and fought back. Derek's greatest weakness was his assumption that his victims would remain isolated, ashamed, and silent. By bringing us together, his crimes had created a community of survivors who could support each other through the long process of healing and recovery. That evening, I returned home to find Emily in the kitchen, making dinner from ingredients we'd bought together that afternoon. The first time in years we'd gone grocery shopping as a family. She looked up when I came in, and I could see the question in her eyes. "It's over," I told her. "He's going to prison for a very long time, and he'll never hurt anyone else the way he hurt us." Emily nodded, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mom, do you think you can ever forgive me for choosing him over you, for letting him turn me against you, for not seeing what he was doing to both of us?" I pulled my daughter into my arms and held her tight. "Baby, there's nothing to forgive. Nothing to..." Derek was a professional manipulator who spent years learning how to exploit the people who loved him. You were his victim, not his accomplice. The fact that you found the strength to fight back when it mattered shows me exactly who you really are. We stood there in our kitchen, in our house, holding each other and crying tears of relief and joy and hope. Outside, spring was beginning to return to Denver. Inside, our family was healing, but the best part of our revenge was still to come. 6 months after Derek's conviction, he ultimately pled guilty to avoid a trial that would have sent him to prison for life. Emily and I had transformed our house into something it had never been before. A genuine home built on honesty, respect, and unconditional love. The physical changes were obvious to anyone who visited. We'd redecorated Derek's office into a bright craft room where Emily could pursue her passion for jewelry making, a hobby Derek had discouraged as impractical. We'd converted the basement into a comfortable apartment for me, giving both of us privacy while maintaining our close connection. Most importantly, we'd installed a security system and changed every lock, ensuring that no one would ever again have the power to throw either of us out of our own home. But the emotional changes ran much deeper. Emily had started therapy with Dr. Sarah Williams, a specialist in domestic abuse recovery, to process the trauma of her marriage to Derek. Through counseling, she'd come to understand that Derek's control tactics were textbook psychological abuse, and that her responses, including the way she'd turned against me, were normal reactions to that kind of systematic manipulation. Abusers are experts at making their victims feel responsible for the abuse, Dr. Williams explained during one of the sessions Emily asked me to attend. Derek convinced Emily that she was protecting her marriage by excluding you, when in reality, he was isolating her from the person most likely to recognize his true nature and help her escape. I'd started my own therapy with Dr. Robert Chen, Margaret's recommendation for dealing with the complex trauma of family betrayal and financial abuse. Dr. Chen helped me understand that my desire to maintain peace at any cost had made me vulnerable to Derek's manipulation, and that setting healthy boundaries wasn't selfish. It was essential for protecting both myself and the people I loved. The legal aftermath of Derek's case had exceeded everyone's expectations. The FBI investigation had uncovered a network of financial crimes spanning multiple states and involving dozens of victims. Derek's cooperation with federal prosecutors, motivated by his desire to avoid the death penalty for the suspected murder in Chicago, had led to arrests of his criminal associates and the recovery of nearly $800,000 in stolen assets. My portion of the recovered funds, combined with the insurance settlement from Derek's fraudulent activities, had given me financial security for the first time in decades. But more importantly, it had given Emily and me the resources to help other families in similar situations. We'd used part of the money to establish the Sullivan Family Recovery Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families heal from financial abuse and manipulation. Working with Dr. Williams and other specialists, we'd created support groups, educational programs, and legal assistance funds for victims of family-based cons. Emily had become the foundation's primary outreach coordinator, using her experience as Derek's victim to help other women recognize the warning signs of financial and psychological abuse. She was particularly effective at reaching isolated spouses and adult children who'd been turned against their own family members by manipulative partners. The hardest part, Emily often told the women in our support groups, is admitting that someone you love has been lying to you about everything. But once you accept that truth, you can start building relationships based on reality instead of manipulation. Our first major success case involved Maria Santos, a 43-year-old woman whose husband had convinced her that her elderly mother was becoming senile and needed to be placed in a care facility. Like Derek, Maria's husband had been working to isolate her mother from the family so he could gain control of her property and savings. With our help, Maria discovered her husband's true motives and was able to protect her mother while ending her abusive marriage. Stories like Maria's reminded me daily that Derek's greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating my determination. It had been assuming that his victims would remain powerless once they understood the truth. In reality, survivors of family abuse often became the most effective advocates for other victims because they understood both the tactics abusers used and the strength required to overcome them. The foundation had also connected me with Sarah, Jennifer, Amanda, and the other women Derek had victimized over the years. We'd formed a kind of chosen family, bound together by our shared experience of survival and recovery. We celebrated each other's victories, supported each other through difficult moments, and had created a network of mutual aid that Derek never could have predicted. Sarah had used her settlement money to buy back her mother's house and had started a consulting business helping elderly homeowners protect themselves from financial scams. Jennifer had rebuilt her family's company and had expanded it into new markets. Amanda had become a victims' rights advocate, working to change laws around elder abuse and suspicious deaths. All of us had transformed our pain into purpose, our victimization into strength. But perhaps the most meaningful change in my life was the relationship I'd rebuilt with Emily. We'd learned to communicate honestly about difficult topics, to respect each other's independence, and to support each other's growth without trying to control or manipulate each other's choices. Emily had started dating again, carefully this time, with a clear understanding of the red flags she'd missed with Derek. Her new boyfriend, Marcus, was a teacher at the local elementary school, who'd gone through his own difficult divorce and understood the importance of healthy communication and mutual respect. Marcus made a point of building a relationship with me as Emily's mother, but he also respected the boundaries we'd established. He didn't try to insert himself into our family dynamic or make suggestions about how we should manage our household. Most importantly, he encouraged Emily's independence and supported her work with the foundation. "Your daughter is amazing," he told me one evening when he came for dinner. "The strength it took to recognize what Derek was doing and fight back. Most people never would have been able to do that. You raised someone special." I was proud of Emily, but I was also proud of myself. At 53, I discovered that I was stronger, smarter, and more resilient than I'd ever imagined. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to stand up for myself, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear of abandonment. 6 months ago, I'd been standing in the snow outside my own house, cast out by my own daughter's husband, and wondering if I'd lost everything that mattered to me. Today, I was surrounded by people who loved and respected me, engaged in meaningful work that helped other families heal, and living in a home that truly belonged to me. Derek had intended to destroy my family and steal everything I'd worked for. Instead, his actions had made Emily and me stronger than we'd ever been, had connected us with a community of survivors who'd become lifelong friends, and had given us a purpose that brought meaning to every day. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek, the man who'd weaponized family relationships for his own gain, had ultimately created the strongest family bonds I'd ever experienced. His attempt to break us had taught us how to build something unbreakable. On Christmas Eve 2024, exactly 1 year after Derek had thrown me out of my house, Emily and I hosted a holiday dinner for 23 people, the women from our support group, their children and partners, Sarah and Jennifer and Amanda, Dr. Williams and her family, Marcus and Janet and Robert, who'd driven up from Phoenix to celebrate with us. As I looked around the table at all these people who'd become my chosen family, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not gratitude for what Derek had done to us. I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone, but gratitude for what we'd built from the wreckage of his betrayal. Emily stood up to make a toast, and her words captured everything I was feeling. "A year ago, a cruel man tried to destroy our family by turning us against each other. He thought that love was a weakness he could exploit, that trust was a vulnerability he could attack. He was wrong. Love isn't what made us vulnerable to his manipulation. Isolation is what made us vulnerable. Love is what saved us." She raised her glass and looked directly at me. "To my mother, who taught me that fighting back isn't about revenge. It's about protecting the people you love. To all the families here tonight who've learned that healing is possible. And to the truth that no one has the right to steal your relationships, your trust, or your hope." Everyone raised their glasses, and as we toasted to survival, recovery, and the families we'd chosen to build together, I thought about how different this Christmas Eve was from the last one. A year ago, I'd been broken, betrayed, and alone. Tonight, I was surrounded by love, purpose, and possibility. Derek Morrison had thought he was throwing away an obstacle to his success. Instead, he'd awakened a force he never saw coming. A mother's love, a daughter's strength, and a community of survivors who refused to let him win. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you for witnessing our journey from betrayal to triumph. Please like and subscribe if our experience has touched you. You never know who else might need to hear that recovery is possible, that families can heal, and that no one's story has to end with someone else's cruelty. Most importantly, Remember this: if someone in your life is trying to isolate you from the people who love you, if they're making you doubt your own judgment or question your own worth, if they're using your love against you, that's not your fault, and it's not permanent. There is always a way back home. There is always hope. There is always strength you haven't discovered yet. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply refusing to let someone else's darkness extinguish your light. Emily and I learned that lesson the hard way, but we learned it together, and it changed everything. Your story can change too.